Hello, I am Shweta Srinivasan and welcome to this video of a Guesstimate Demonstration. So in my past videos, as part of this Cracking the Consulting interview series, I have demonstrated how to solve a profitability case, a market entry case, and an unconventional case. We also have a video on how to bag off-campus job opportunities with MBB. So in this video, we'll be covering guesstimates. Now, there are two main benefits you would get by solving guesstimates. Number one, it would directly help you in your interviews, both management consulting interviews as well as other interviews, because guesstimates are very popular interview questions nowadays. And the second benefit is a good practice in structuring. So if you practice a lot of guesstimates, you will be able to improve your structuring for your other cases and in general your thinking as well. So I would definitely urge you to include guesstimates as a key component of your case preparation. So let's begin this session. So first we have the guesstimate statement. In this case, the statement is as follows. Estimate the number of UPI transactions conducted in India in 2020. Now, once you've gotten the statement and once you've clarified this with your interviewer, the next step is to ask a few clarifying questions. The goal of clarifying questions here is to narrow the scope of the guesstimate and to understand what exactly you're going to be estimating. So here I would be classifying transactions as P2P, that is peer to peer, P2B, peer to business, and B2B, business to business. And I would ask the interviewer, is there any specific type of transaction you'd like me to focus on? Or would you like me to, consider all three transactions? And the interviewer tells me, consider only P2P and P2B transactions. All right, so this is what I'll be focusing on for this guesstimate, and this is the scope of the guesstimate. Now, the first step, once you've identified the scope of the guesstimate, is to come up with an overall formula. Now, you can actually start solving the guesstimate at the get-go, but it's a good idea to present an overall formula. So you actually understand what you have to estimate and you can chart out a path for your guesstimate. And especially for complicated guesstimates, this becomes very important so you don't miss out any components. So this is what I'm considering. Number of UPI transactions in India in 2020 or number of transactions equals the number of UPI users multiplied by the number of annual UPI transactions per user. Now we've already clarified that we're talking about P2P and P2B transactions. So I'm just going to consider the number of UPI users in general. So in order to go ahead with this guesstimate. And further, the number of annual UPI transactions per user, I'm going to analyze as number of transactions per quarter per user multiplied by 4. And the reason I'm considering this on a quarterly basis is because in 2020, April to June saw a pretty heavy lockdown. So I believe that that lockdown would definitely have certain level of impact on the overall number of transactions. Hence, I'm doing this on a quarterly basis. And it's always a good idea to use your knowledge of what is happening around you in order to come up with good structures and good ways to actually analyze items, and that would definitely give you brownie points. So now let's start with analyzing the first aspect, which is the number of UPI users in India. So I would start with the population of India, 1.4 billion. The first filter I'm going to add is basis age group. Now throughout your guesstimate, essentially what you're doing is adding filters, segmenting the main group into multiple subgroups, choosing a separate subgroup for your guesstimate, and then further drilling down. So essentially, you'll apply multiple filters and you'll arrive at the final number. So the first filter I'm applying is age group. Why? Because I feel that, UPI transactions for those below 18 and those above 60 would be like not as important or not as numerous as those in the 18 to 60 age group. So that is my assumption, and I'm going to go ahead with that. And I am according a 30%, 55%, and a 15% weightage to each of these three age groups because India has a high population of youth. I would corroborate this with the interviewer, make sure that these numbers seem okay. And if they seem okay, I'll proceed. So this gives me around 800 million people in the 18 to 60 age group, and I will proceed with this. The next filter I'm going to add is a rural urban filter. And the reason I would add this filter would become, understandable when I'm talking about the next filter. So at this stage, I'm considering rural population of 70%, urban of around 30%. I believe the actual numbers are closer to 65% and 35%, but for ease of calculation, I am considering these numbers. You can definitely do this sort of an approximation or rounding off. Again, make sure you check with the interviewer and see if this is okay. So this gives me around 560 million under the rural segment and 240 million in the urban segment. Now the next filter I'm going to apply is the filter for smartphone and internet penetration, because what is one of the most important factors which determines whether you use UPI or not? It is whether you have access to smartphone and internet. So this is sort of why I used the rural urban filter earlier, because I believe that internet penetration and smartphone penetration rates would be different in each segment. So I'm considering a 40% rate for rural and a 70% rate for urban. Again, you can check this with the interviewer to make sure the numbers are fine. And this gives me 220 million and around 170 million each for consideration for further, guesstimation. The next filter I'm going to apply is banked population. Now, all people who have access to a smartphone and internet need not necessarily have a bank account, which is important for UPI. I'm considering an 80% penetration rate for banking. The reason I'm considering this high percentage is because, these are people who have access to smartphones and internet. So I'm going to consider a high percentage here. And if the interviewer tells me, this number seems okay, I would arrive at the final number, which is like 320 million, who are the banked population with access to smartphone and internet in rural and urban India, belonging to the 18 to 60 age group. And the final filter I'm going to use is the percentage of people who use UPI. Now, all those who have access to a bank account need not necessarily be using UPI. There are multiple factors here. There is factors regarding awareness, there's factors regarding accessibility and knowing how to use UPI. So considering all these factors, I'm going to assume a percentage of 50. You can arrive at this number by interacting with the interviewer, maybe delving deeper into each of these three factors and understanding the interplay. So here I'm arriving at a 50%, UPI adoption rate, which gives me around 150 million people in the 18 to 60 age group in India who actually actively use UPI. So I've sort of arrived at the number of UPI users in India. Now we will move on to the next aspect of the guesstimate. But before that, I would urge you to, try this out on your own. If you come up with some different filters, if you have some other ideas for segmentation, do mention it in the comment section. I will definitely take a look and reply. The next aspect is to understand the number of annual UPI transactions per user. So I am going to consider this as the sum of transactions which happen each quarter. And I've already given you the rationale for assuming this on a quarterly basis. This is because in one quarter, there was a heavy lockdown imposed. And I believe that that would definitely have some sort of effect on the total number of transactions in that quarter in comparison to previous and succeeding quarters. Now, I'm splitting the type of transactions into P2P and P2B. And what I would do is I would weight all types of transactions basis income category. That will become clear in the next slide. But this is something I would definitely mention to the interviewer. Now in P2B, peer to business, I'm going to consider, purchase of staples and grocery. So these are some of your essential goods, purchase of discretionary products and others. So now this could include, travel expenses. This could include, purchasing some additional products. This could include, trades, etc. So I'm just putting a separate bucket called others because I can't comprehensively list out every single spending. So I've listed out the main spending and I've put others. Now let's proceed with this. Now, this is a table which I would come up with after discussing with the interviewer. So let's just break this down because this seems to be a quite complicated table, but in reality, it's super simple. I've already said I'm going to analyze this on a quarterly basis. So I'm considering the 4 quarters, Jan to March, April to June, July to September, and October to December. Now that's simple. Next, I'm going to split the people into lower middle class and below, middle class and upper middle class and above segments. And the reason I'm doing this is because I feel that the number of UPI transactions would definitely vary between the three classes. So I'm considering the three classes here. And within each class, I'm considering, the weekly UPI transactions for P2P, for staples, for discretionary, and for other products. So this gives me like a very comprehensive table which I can use. And when you're doing a guesstimate, there would be a lot of times when you would have to come up with tables like this. For example, you could be analyzing multiple income classes and what they would be spending on different metrics in different months. So such sort of tables are very much possible during an interview. So if you practice enough guesstimates, you'll sort of get used to such complicated tables which have multiple factors as well. So once I've, set up the structure for the table, I would come up with the numbers basis discussion with the interviewer. So now let's start with P2P. So first off, the number of UPI transactions depend on two factors. First is frequency of in general transactions. Second, the percentage of transactions which occur through UPI. So let me break this down. So say for example, in a week, I am transacting with peers like 15 times, of which 30% of the time I actually do it via UPI, and the remaining 70% of the time I do it like just by exchanging cash, maybe some other means. So this would mean that the total number of UPI transactions for peer to peer for me would be 30% times 15, which is around 4.5. So I'm considering two main factors, frequency and digital preference or UPI preference. And basis these two factors, I would come up with all the numbers. So here let's start with P2P. So I believe that P2P transaction would be similar across all classes who have access to UPI. Now remember, this is being done for the 150 million people who actually have access to UPI. So for them, I feel that across classes, my assumption is that number of transactions will be the same. Digital preference would be higher for upper middle class plus. So this gives me, 1.5, 2, and 3 transactions peer to peer per week in the Jan to March quarter. Now, April to June quarter, I'm assuming that across the board, the number of transactions per week in the peer-to-peer segment would be lower. Why? Because when you think about, when you actually interact with peers in this way, it's usually if you go out, say you're splitting bills, say you're paying for your friend and later you get back the money, etc. And most of those activities were halted in April to June, or almost all of them were halted. So I believe that the number of transactions across the board would have fallen. And from that quarter onwards, that is July onwards, I am assuming a revival of peer-to-peer transactions. So it goes back to the 1.5, 2, and 3 for lower middle class, below middle class, and upper middle class and above segments. So this is my assumption for P2P transactions. Next, let's look at staples. Now, staples, it's slightly more complex than P2P. Now, I believe that frequency would be higher for middle class and lower middle class and below. Why? Because their ticket sizes are low, and hence they might be getting smaller purchases or making smaller purchases more often in a week. So this is my assumption. And I believe that, upper middle class and above might make a bulk payment, maybe like through Big Basket or Grocers, maybe once a week or once in 2 weeks. So that is one factor. The other factor is digital preference, which I feel would be higher for upper middle class and above, moderate for middle class, and lower for lower middle class and below. So there is, a gradation of frequency which leans more in favor of lower middle class and below, and a gradation of digital preference which is, higher for the upper middle class and above. So considering these two factors, I will consider one transaction a week in staples for lower middle class below, two for middle class, and one for upper middle class and above in the Jan to March quarter. Now, in the April to June quarter, there would be some disruption, of course. So I believe that for lower middle class and below, frequency would have fallen. Digital preference would have increased because that increased across the board during the pandemic. So I'm retaining it at one transaction UPI per week. Now, for the middle class, while digital preference would have already been moderate, I doubt it would have increased too much during the pandemic, but frequency would have definitely fallen to a greater extent. So I'm considering 1.5 transactions per week. And for upper middle class or high class, digital adoption was already pretty high. But during the pandemic, my assumption is that people started looking at some gourmet platforms, some specific apps for specific types of products. So the upper middle class and above would have gotten a bit more experimental with respect to trying out different apps, different platforms. Hence their frequency of transaction could have increased, because instead of buying all products in one platform, they might buy certain products from platform A, certain from platform B. So I'm considering two transactions a week. From July to September onwards, I'm considering that across the board, the number of UPI transactions for staples has either increased or remained the same. And that's similar for October to December as well. So these are my assumptions and numbers for the staples category for lower middle class, below middle class, and upper middle class and above. Now let's look at discretionary and others together. So I believe discretionary spending through UPI per week would be lowest for lower middle class and below, moderate for middle class, and higher for upper middle class and above. Discretionary spending fell across the board in the lockdown period. So the frequency has definitely dropped across the board. And from July onwards, it started recovering. So you sort of see a slow recovery in terms of number of transactions per week conducted on UPI. And notably for lower middle class and below, I've sort of started their discretionary account through UPI from July onwards because I feel that while in the past they might have preferred cash, after July, the impact of digital adoption during the pandemic might have caught on for discretionary spending as well. So these are my assumptions overall for the four main categories of spending for the three income classes across the four quarters. Now, this is a pretty comprehensive table. This is something you would come up after discussion with the interviewer. So you will definitely be able to, get a lot of insights, will be able to show your own business acumen. So this is a amazing spot for you to shine during the interview. So when we look at the total, right? So for lower middle class and below, across the four categories throughout the four quarters, there have been 12 transactions per week. For middle class, it's 16.25. And for upper middle class and above, it's 25.5. Now we just have to multiply these by the respective factors. So average number of transactions a year would be first considering a weighted average. I'm considering 20% distribution for lower middle class below, 60% for middle class and 20% for upper middle class above, which gives me zero point 0.2 times 12 plus zero point 0.6 times 16 on average plus zero point 0.2 times 25, essentially rounding off here. So this will give me, a weighted average. Now I have to multiply this by 4 because I'm considering this on a per week basis and each month has 4 weeks on average. So I'm considering multiplied by 4. And then I'm multiplying it by 3 because we are doing this per quarter and one quarter has 3 months. So this will be into 4 into 3, which gives me a total of on average 200 transactions per UPI user per year. So I would urge you to maybe like pause the video here, like spend a little bit more time on this slide because I understand this is a little bit content heavy. But when you're doing this as a case, this would be super intuitive to you because you are coming up with the structure on your own and you'll definitely be able to do this easily. This is another reason why it's a good idea to have a full formula. You can even develop a separate formula for this section, which is equal to summation, the transaction per category multiplied by weightage for that category multiplied by 12, which is 4 times 3. So it'll just give you a better idea of what you're working with. So let's look at what we've seen so far. Number of UPI users in India, we've estimated this to be around 150 million. Annual UPI transactions per user has been estimated at around 200. So this gives me the total number of UPI transactions in India in 2020 to be equal to around 30 billion, which is 150 million times 200. So we've arrived at the final number here. We've essentially finished the guesstimate. Now you can leave it at this, but it's always a good idea to do a sanity check. Now I always do a sanity check after a guesstimate. So what exactly is a sanity check, right? You've arrived at the number. I've arrived at 30 billion. You might arrive at 200 billion. Someone might arrive at zero point 0.5 billion. Now that's just a number. How do you verify this number? Or how do you, tell the interviewer that, I believe that this is a ballpark number. You can't just say 30 billion and tell the interviewer, you know what, this seems about right. You have to, substantiate that statement with something. And that's what a sanity check helps you do. It's essentially a way to see whether this number makes sense, whether this number is in the ballpark or not. There are multiple ways you can do a sanity check for different guesstimates. So say you're doing a guesstimate in the top down method, that is starting with the population or starting with a bigger segment and then drilling down. You can do a sanity check by going bottom up quickly. A sanity check should not be a complete guesstimate on its own. It should be a quick back of the envelope calculation. Should not take longer than say like a few seconds, maybe a minute, depending on how much time you have. So do a sanity check to tell the interviewer that see this number either makes sense. If the number seems off, that is also fine. Then try to give a rationale as to where you could have made a mistake. So this is my sanity check. My first check is simple. I'm going to tell the interviewer, we got this number 30 billion. We can check NPCI's databases because NPCI is the parent organization for UPI. We can check NPCI's databases for the exact number of transactions because they'll definitely be maintaining transactions. And if you're following the news, you would have heard that, recently we reached the maximum number of UPI transactions per month as 2.8 billion transactions. So you can maybe throw those numbers if you're aware of them, or if you just know that NPCI like releases this data, that's good enough. So my first check is, if you want to actually check this number, we can definitely look at this database. But I would also like to, verify the validity or sanctity of this number. So let me just do a quick sanity check. First off, we know that 30 billion transactions is what we've estimated to have occurred in 2020. This translates to around 2.5 billion transactions per month. How? 30 by 12. Next, we also estimated that the number of people who use UPI are 150 million, which means that as per our calculation, we are saying that on average, I'm using UPI for transactions 16 times in a month. Now, I'm going to make one assumption that in 2020, 50% of our transactions were digital. Seems to be a relatively high number, but given 2020, I believe that digital adoption could have justified such a number. So if I consider total number of digital transactions to be 50%, this means that I am saying on average, an individual in India who has access to UPI would have transacted 32 times a month, which means we engaged in a little over one monetary transaction a day in 2020. So this seems quite feasible, right? On an average, in one day, if you spend money or any sort of monetary transaction once or a little bit more than one, that does seem quite feasible. In reality, you might argue that we definitely pay a lot more than once a day. Maybe if you're traveling somewhere, you would pay twice just for that. But this is 2020, so most of the time we were locked up at home. So I believe that this number seems quite feasible. And I would tell the interviewer, I feel that this is something which is highly possible. So I feel that this number seems like pretty good for this guesstimate. So what we have done here is we've brought a more abstract number, 30 billion, to something which we can relate to, like on an individual level. So if I'm talking about, 30 billion UPI transactions, for all I know, it could be 300 billion or it could be, 3 million. But if I'm telling, this 30 billion UPI transaction roughly means that you transacted in general once a day each month. So that seems like something I can relate to, and that is something which I can quantify basis personal experience as well. So that's the goal of a sanity check. You sort of bring a more abstract number into something you can relate with, into something which you can actually verify basis personal experience, basis some other numbers as well. So it's always a good idea to do a sanity check. So now that we've sort of completed arriving at a number and doing a sanity check, the next aspect is a discussion. Now, again, a lot of people wouldn't do this during a guesstimate, but I would urge you to, consider doing this if there is time. You can maybe talk to the interviewer or just present a one-line statement. What this aims to do is, you've arrived at the number, you found that, it's a pretty good ballpark figure. What does this number mean? That's what discussion aims to do. So first, why the large number here? 30 billion seems to be a pretty good number. So there are three main factors I'm considering. First, UPI in India currently is free. There are zero transaction fees. So that would definitely urge adoption. Second, a pandemic-induced digital shift is definitely in place. So that would definitely have a huge impact on UPI. And finally, ease of use and convenience. I think most of us would agree that it's super easy to transfer money from one bank account to another through UPI rather than the traditional means. The next aspect is, like this is like super good. We have like a large number of UPI transactions, but there are definitely some risks. So if again, this is a place where you can demonstrate your business acumen. So I'm aware of the fact that, the RBI has recently expressed concern on the load which banks have to take because of a large number of UPI transactions. Now, most people are, executing minor transactions through UPI. This would definitely increase the load and some of the, weight on banks. So that could result in some disruption of services or in slower services. And second, there are certain rules which are currently under discussion of capping the market share of players to not more than like a little over 30%, I believe. So that could definitely result in some issues for the entire UPI segment because Google Pay and Phone Pay currently have a huge market share in the segment today. So these are some risks I would discuss. And of course, some trends and news. Because of this overload on banks, there are considerations of including wallets for UPI as well. So instead of moving from bank account to bank account, you can move from a wallet to a bank account as well. So those are some current discussion topics which are on ground. And you also have entry of NUE, so new umbrella entities. So that could also, create a lot more diversity, create new services in this area. So these are some topics I would discuss. Again, if you don't have time, you can just say, so this looks like we have a number of 30 billion. This translates to around one transaction a day, which seems feasible. And I believe that, because of the pandemic induced digital shift, the ease of use and convenience, and the zero transaction fee, this seems to be a pretty feasible number. And in the future, I do believe that UPI has a lot more potential to grow as more people adopt it. That is a cool way to end your guesstimate as well, instead of just leaving it at that number. So consider doing that if you have time. I mean, like, go to town with demonstrating your business acumen and your current affairs knowledge. Now let's analyze what we've looked at throughout this guesstimate. First, clarifying the scope of the guesstimate is important. Now, if I had included B2B, if I had included some other type of transactions, that would have been a separate path within the guesstimate, and I would have had to spend a lot more time. Next aspect is presenting a clear and initial formula. This is super important. When I started doing guesstimates, I did not employ this initially. And there have been times when I have forgotten certain filters which I should have added, or forgotten to calculate some aspects, or forgotten to multiply by a factor because I did not write out a clear initial formula. And since then, I have been, spending some time creating an initial formula akin to an initial structure when you're solving cases, and that really helps. Third factor is applying all the appropriate filters. Now, this is sort of where you demonstrate your prioritization skills, your business acumen skills, because you need to know what filters matter. If we're talking about an edtech platform, it's important to look at, whether they have access to internet and smartphones, and whether they have access to specific devices for the students, because otherwise it's going to be very difficult. So it's very important to think of what filters really matter and apply those filters. Redundant filters are not necessary. For each guesstimate, you need not keep splitting them according to age, according to income category. You need not do that unless it's absolutely necessary, or unless by splitting it into different segments, you'll be able to arrive at some different numbers. So use your discretion when it comes to filtering. Next aspect is leveraging relatable experiences. So when it comes to peer-to-peer, you can actually leverage your experiences. Say, like, during a regular month, not a lockdown period, this is how much I used to transact with my friends. So I believe that during lockdown period, this could have fallen by X%, and then it would have recovered. So use your personal experience, because you need some sort of, a hook or some sort of an anchor to come up with the numbers in the first place. And then I offered a quick sanity check. So I did not like create some crazy structure. I did not do another guesstimate. I just did a quick back of the envelope calculation to see if this number makes sense. Next is providing possible reasons to see why the number could be off. In this case, I did not have to utilize that, or say the number ended up being 300 billion. So that would essentially mean like 10 transactions a day on average if I were to do the sanity check. And during a period of lockdown, that seems a little overboard. So at that point, I would have been like, so this seems a little on the higher end. I believe a reason why we might have overestimated the number of UPI transactions in India could be, an overestimation in, say, the grocery transactions per week. Maybe we would not have been able to actually go out so much and get so much groceries. And even peer-to-peer transactions might not have recovered to that extent once the lockdowns were released, because people were still wary. So that is some sort of a justification I would have given, or just to understand where you went wrong. And it's always a good idea. It's all right if you sort of step off the mark a bit. It's important to acknowledge the fact that, this could be a little high and this is why it happened. The structured approach throughout the guesstimate is what matters. And finally, I discussed the number and offered some key trends. I did not just leave the number like that. I wanted to make it look like, okay, we arrived at this number. So what's the purpose of arriving at this number? It's to sort of see where the market is, where it can go, etc. So that's always a good idea. So with that, I'd like to wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Do check out Cracking the Consulting Interview, an initiative I started, and follow us on LinkedIn, on Medium, and like our videos on YouTube, and subscribe if you find this helpful. And I'll see you later. Thank you.